It's a sugar, yet it can reduce visceral fat, potentially reduce liver fat, potentially reduce liver inflammation. It's not allulose, it's not one of these like sweeteners that I've talked about before, it's an actual sugar. You're probably thinking it might be honey. I'm gonna come right out and tell you what it is because, I don't know, I'm a nice guy, right? It's maple syrup, but I don't want you to click off the video because I do want to explain what the deal is, and there's also a few little bits of nuance that you should know, because if you just went down to the grocery store and you grabbed maple syrup, it might not work the way you want it to, so we need to kind of clear some stuff up. After today's video, I put a link down below for LMNT Electrolytes. That is a link for a free sample variety pack with any purchase. So they are 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 potassium, 60 magnesium. So really nice ratio if you're sweating, or a really good ratio if you are not eating a lot of carbohydrates so your insulin levels are lower, or if you're maybe fasting or training fasted. So I usually drink LMNT when I'm working out because it's replenishing sodium, but also it gives me feels like I'm consuming something that's energizing, but without the calories and without the sugar. I definitely recommend it, curbs the appetite. It's been a part of my lifestyle for a very long time. So that link is down below in the top line of the description. Okay, so the study that we're looking at with maple syrup first was published in Nutrients. Full disclaimer, this particular study was in rats, but don't worry, we have human data too. But I want to explain what we kind of learned from this study first and what's so fascinating. They put rats on a high-fat, high-sugar diet for 8 weeks. Basically what this did is it put them in a surplus and it put them in a state of what is called energy toxicity, where they have so much energy, it starts messing up fuel partitioning and messing up all kinds of things cellularly, metabolically. Okay, then what they did is on top of this, they gave them 1 gram of sucrose, which is table sugar, or 1 gram of 6 different kinds of sweeteners, one of which was, of course, maple syrup. They also used molasses and agave, a couple other ones, but maple syrup is the one we're highlighting today. Bottom line is that the maple syrup group significantly reduced markers of insulin resistance compared to others, and definitely compared to the sucrose. So gram for gram, literally, the sugar from maple syrup actually improved markers of insulin resistance, whereas, of course, table sugar negatively impacted it. But what does that have to do with visceral fat? Well, 2 parts. For one, there was a reduction in interleukin-1 beta in the liver of these rats, which demonstrates that there was less inflammation metabolically in the liver. Visceral fat is an issue with liver fat essentially expanding into that space. Okay, so the pot belly, the visceral fat that's underneath, all that stuff, that is spread from the liver. So liver fat and visceral fat, they're almost proxies for one another. Like if you have high amounts of liver fat, you're probably gonna have high amounts of visceral. You don't see high visceral fat without high liver fat. And the inflammation in the liver is a big part of that. Not to mention the insulin resistance piece. When the liver becomes insulin resistant, or the body becomes insulin resistant, it impacts the liver and how the liver stores fat, right? So the liver starts to store fat in the hepatic triglyceride form, okay? And then that eventually spreads out into the visceral area. This is metabolically active fat, which is not the same as the fat that you can touch and squeeze on the outside of your body. Metabolically active fat changes our metabolism, and also, inversely, our metabolism changes our visceral fat. So maple syrup is interesting because compared to regular sugar, it has a different effect. Here's what the researchers had to say. Natural sweeteners, especially maple syrup, molasses, and agave syrup, attenuate the development of insulin resistance and reduce hepatic inflammation compared to sucrose in rats that have been overfed. What about in humans? Well, the data that we do have in humans, we have a newer study that hasn't been fully published yet. It was announced last July. It was really interesting. So they have these 42 subjects split into 2 groups. One group did 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. Another group did 2 tablespoons of liquid table sugar, so liquid sucrose. They did this for 4 weeks, and then they crossed over. It's called a crossover design, where the groups swapped. Okay, so now the other groups did the other thing. What they found is that both groups, when they had the maple syrup, responded markedly better to an oral glucose tolerance test at the end of the 4-week period. Oral glucose tolerance test is like, I'll give you an example. Like when my wife was pregnant with our kids, during the first pregnancy, they gave her an oral glucose tolerance test where they had her test for like sort of gestational diabetes. So they had her drink this awful, vile, like 50-gram glucose drink. And then they measured like how she responded to oral glucose tolerance test. How was her tolerance? She was fine, but a lot of people are not fine, right? Meaning they have poor oral glucose tolerance. So meaning when they consume glucose, their ability to tolerate it or deal with it is not very good. What happens here is you have a malfunction where insulin is not sort of matching what needs to happen here. Insulin is a good thing in this context because insulin does a lot of things as a signaling, but it also does one of the most notable things it does, not the most important, but the most notable things is it brings blood sugar down because it allows sugar to get into the cell. If you have something like maple syrup, which is rich in antioxidants and lowers oxidative stress, the signal for insulin to signal to the cell to let the glucose in is likely stronger compared to regular sugar, which means that because there's less oxidative stress, when the sugar is consumed, it's less like insulin stress on the body, which means that later on, the body's not becoming resistant to it. Remember what insulin resistance is, right? It's like a white noise that's on. So if you live by a freeway, eventually you get used to the sound of the freeway and it becomes white noise. But if you've never lived by a freeway before and you go stay the night at Billy Bob's house by the freeway, you're gonna be up all night because you're hearing it. You're hearing this whoosh, 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 whoosh. Billy Bob has become resistant to the white noise. Like he is insulin resistant to that white noise, right? So insulin resistance where you're so used to so much sugar coming in that your body just no longer responds to it. It's not sensitive anymore. Whereas it seems as though maple syrup, the best way to describe it is it builds a wall along that freeway so that you don't hear the freeway noise as much, so then you're not as intolerant. You're more tolerant and you can handle the sugar better. The reason that this is potentially happening, and there was a study published in Pharmaceutical Biology, is likely because they've identified over 24 and then more compounds that are active in maple syrup. These are compounds that have anti-inflammatory properties, of course antioxidant properties, flavonols, things that are like catechin, epicatechin, similar to green tea. So I don't want you to think that maple syrup is just fair game, free sugar. It's still going to impact you the same way sugar would from a carbohydrate standpoint and things like that. It's still sugar and you should probably control it. But if you were to swap regular sugar for maple syrup, it's significantly different. Now additionally, this is what's important. The literature has shown that if you go and you get like a light, sort of amber, light colored maple syrup, it's not going to have nearly the effect. You really do need to go for a darker grade. What happens is maple syrup that is harvested later in the season has had a chance, I don't want to say ferment, but there is probably some fermentation that occurs. It essentially becomes denser and denser with antioxidants and nutrients and flavonols. So the later that it's harvested, that's why it's a darker amber color. It's the same reason that why like a passion fruit doesn't have a ton of antioxidants, but a blueberry that's super dark blue and a wild blueberry that's super duper dark blue and concentrated has more antioxidant potential. Food is not just food. A blueberry is not just a blueberry. Honey is not just honey. Raw honey is different because it's not pasteurized and heated and it doesn't denature the antioxidants and the antibacterial effect. Just like maple syrup is not the same. Mrs. Butterworth's maple syrup is not the same as getting good, true late harvest Vermont maple syrup. If you're really looking at swapping out your sugar for maple syrup, spend the extra money and get the good stuff and treat it more like a supplement and more like an antioxidant sort of compound than you would just a fair game sugar. I would recommend using something like stevia, monk fruit, allulose for your standard sweeteners, but treat yourself in moments of indulgence with baked goods and whatnot that are sweetened with maple syrup. I'll see you tomorrow.